but to combine it with Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to share with you the most important things that you need to know before you go on your very first tea trip to China. Knowing these things are going to help you get the most out of your tea travels, whether you're coming with us or going it on your own. These key points come from my own adventures and misadventures, and I've distilled my experiences down into a set of takeaways that you can use and adapt for your own tea travel. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce you to the people who make up ZhenTea. If you've been around for a while, you probably know who we are, but maybe you didn't know exactly what each of us bring. I'm obviously Phil. I bring a Western perspective of Chinese tea to the business. With only 10 years of experience with Chinese tea, I still have a lot to learn, and I'm excited to bring that information to you. Zhen is from a tea family and has decades of experience with Chinese tea and over a decade of experience diving into Chinese tea from the Western perspective here in North America. This is where her role really shines as clearing up a lot of the confusion and misunderstanding about Chinese tea. Finally, Jian Li, our powerhouse tea consultant. Jian Li has over 3 decades of experience with Chinese tea. She has given courses at the university level. She has published 7 books on Chinese tea. She travels and works with farmers and producers to bridge the gap between the academic and the practical, and much, much more. One of the main things we do at ZhenTea is we bring fine tasting grade Chinese tea to Canada, the USA, and the world on our web boutique. You can check out a link to that in the description down below. But in bringing tasting grade Chinese tea to the world, a big part of our role is education. And if you're here on our YouTube channel, you found a fantastic resource for that. But be sure to check out our website, because there you'll find a blog with lots more information. You'll also find a magazine called Cha Ren, which is fantastic. And finally, we do in-person tastings and seminars. These are really where the rubber hits the road. We get to taste tea in person or talk in person and interact. While I love YouTube, nothing really beats an in-person experience sipping tea together, and I hope to be able to see you at one of those someday. When I went on my very first tea trip to China, my goal was quite simple: to learn all about tea processing and to taste a lot of tea. And my first trip was totally amazing. We started off in Beijing and stayed there for a couple days to get over the jet lag. From there, we jumped on a train to Xi'an to see the terracotta soldiers and do a little bit of tourism. From there, we went to Chengdu, and I got to meet the legendary Mr. Su, the inventor of Sugong Cha, an absolutely magnificent jasmine green tea with little white jasmine flowers floating on a bed of jade green tea. From there, it was on to Mengdingshan, famous for its ancient tea gardens, where the domestication of tea plants began over 2,000 years ago. There, I got to see the making of Mengding Ganlu green tea and Mengding Huangya yellow tea. From garden to cup. Then Ya'an, beginning of the Tea Horse Road, where ZhenTea, Tibet tea, has historically began its trek westward. Next was a little bit of teapot kung fu in Sichuan. Then over to Sichuanbana in Yunnan province, home of the 6 famous tea mountains. In 2 weeks, we covered this much of a country, almost the size of the United States. We did many stops, but there was so much more we could have done. It's a huge distance, something like 3,000 kilometers, like driving from Toronto to Calgary. Absolutely packed with things to do, but there was many more things we could have done, both culture and tea related. And in the end, I somehow got a fever and we had to cancel the end of our trip. This was a bummer for me, and it was a bummer for Jen and Jian Li as well. We had to go back to Beijing, get me recovered, pack me on a plane, and send me back to Canada. So did I achieve my goal? Well, yes and no. But everything was really blurry. I felt like I should have learned more. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did learn some things. But there was this nagging sense that I just missed out on a lot. It was kind of like that full but empty feeling after you eat like a big bucket of fried chicken. I was so excited to finally go to China. But when it was all over, I was left asking myself, what just happened? Of course, it wasn't a total wash at all. I did visit tea gardens, and I did learn about tea processing, and I tasted a lot of tea. But everywhere I went, the machines were different, even if they were used for the same processing step. And in some places, the producer didn't do the steps in the same order that was on the tea processing flowchart that many of you are familiar of. I'm pretty sure he wasn't doing it wrong. I was hit with a massive amount of information, and I had no compass to help me know what to grab onto and what to just let go for now. So for the second trip, when Jen asked me what I wanted to see and what I wanted to learn about, I knew I had to narrow things down based on this previous experience. So my first choice was one of my favorite teas, Bayat Silan. The reason I was so interested in this tea in particular is because the taste is incredible. You can sit down and gong fu brew this tea with a gaiwan or with a yixing teapot, or you can just brew it in a Western style teapot. But no matter what, you are hit with this delightful, roasty, toasty, buttery, creamy flavor with hints of floral that always reminds me of fresh pastries. In short, I wanted to learn, where does the croissant in a cup come from? We still toured the tea gardens and learned about different cultivars. We still learned a little bit about the village and its culture and history. But this time my focus was clear. I could learn about other things, but still save space for my primary mission, finding out where does the croissant in a cup come from. So I was super excited to hit the tasting room. But when we started tasting teas, I was really shocked. The teas we were tasting tasted nothing like the Bayat Silan I had come to know and love. And we must have tasted a dozen teas. We're not talking about one or two samples here. All from the same garden, all from the same rock star producer. I was looking at the wall. He had awards plastered all over the place. This was for sure the right guy. I mean, Zhen was with me. Of course it's the right guy. Tea after tea, one was quite vegetal, a little bit to the green side. Another one presented some light floral notes, but nothing even close to the buttery creamy I was hoping for. I started to think that maybe the tea I loved was just a lucky year and we wouldn't be able to get it again. I couldn't contain myself any longer and I had to ask Jen, what's going on? And she said, don't worry, this is Mao Cha. Mao Cha is an almost finished tea, and for different tea categories that means different things. But for Bayat Silan, it means it's not roasted yet. We have a video about Mao Cha that you can find here on our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about that. So I'm relatively calm now, and the gentleman who roasts the tea walks into the room with lots of samples to taste, and I'm thinking things are really looking up. My sense of calmness didn't last for long. The first tea we tasted was really roasty. It wasn't burnt, but it was really strong and didn't have any hints of what I was looking for. Mind you, it was very different than the Mao Cha we had just been tasting. The tea we had after that was quite decent as well, but still no hints of that buttery creaminess. So this is where a little piece of magic started to happen. Every tea we tasted, Jian Li would ask the roaster a bunch of questions about the roasting technique he used for that particular tea. And he would answer her in his own words. She was using his description of his techniques and her knowledge about tea and her definitions about tea to kind of decode what was happening. And between his description and her questions, they were kind of calibrating their tea language so that they could understand each other. This was absolutely amazing to watch. But even though it was amazing to watch, I was still really sad because I still hadn't tasted anything close to croissant in a cup. Finally, I couldn't contain myself anymore and I had to ask Jen, these are roasted, what's going on? I still don't taste it. And she said, don't worry, we're heading to the roasting room. The roaster of Bayat Silan is the last roaster in the village who still roasts tea over charcoal. Roasting tea by any means is a true craft, but roasting tea over charcoal is a master craft. I mean, there's no dial to get the temperature right. You've got to pick the wood, stoke the wood, and calibrate the temperature with a carefully controlled layer of ash on the coals. In the end, the roaster pulled an all-nighter to roast the tea to Zhen Li's specifications, and when I walked into the room, immediately the aroma was there. I could smell something familiar, that gentle roasty with the hints of butteriness. As the producer started to brew the tea, more of that creamy, toasty aroma rose up into my nose. When we sipped the tea, it was there, smooth and buttery with hints of floral. I mean, it was just roasted the night before, but it wasn't perfect. But all the pieces were there. The smell of the dry leaf, the smell of the brewed leaf, the taste of the liquor were all lining up. Croissant in a cup was back. Before we left for this trip to China, I not only knew that I wanted to see how Baiyacilan was made, but I focused in on a very specific step in the making, the roasting, the source of that delicious, buttery croissant in a cup. My experience on the first tea trip wasn't dissimilar to this, tasting teas at various phases of processing, but selecting a specific phase and diving into it. You might think you're not going to learn as much, but I think the opposite is true. You will learn much more. Tea making is very deep and complicated, and the tea processing chart doesn't tell the whole story. Every tea is different. Every green tea process is different. Every oolong tea process is different. Having focus allows you to tease apart this complexity into bite-sized pieces and make sure that you get the most out of your tea trip. Earlier on, I gave you a quick blitz through my first tea trip to China with its bitter ending, but it wasn't all bad. It wasn't all bad at all, actually. Now I want to share with you some highlights from that part of the trip where I went to Yunnan province. And the reason I want to share with you Yunnan province is because it's so different there. I mean, of course it's different. The whole reason we go is because it's different. But I didn't know how different it would be until I was actually there. When we finally arrived in Zhenglong village, what struck me was how, one of the many things that struck me about the village that was different was how far away the tea garden was from the village. And it wasn't really just the raw distance, but also how rugged the hike was. There was no drive-in access or even a road to this tea garden. We took a dirt road out of the village for some time, and then we got off of the dirt road onto a trail that actually disappeared and reappeared every now and then. And at this time I was already fighting a fever. And I had to wonder, like, what happens if Yan or one of his family members needs to hike up here to do some work, and they're sick too? I mean, the path was sometimes quite obstructed, and there's frequent windstorms in these jungles that knock stuff down. So you can't just, you can't be assured that the pathway will be clear. And on the way, I even saw huts where the villagers sometimes cook themselves a meal or even stay overnight because they just got delayed trying to get to where they were going. I mean, can you even imagine having to camp out overnight, kind of unplanned, because you had to clear the trail just to get to the point where you could do the job you originally set out to do? Then when we finally arrived in the tea garden, I actually didn't even notice because the tea trees blended in perfectly with the jungle. There were fruit trees and other kinds of foods like bamboo shoots and whole bamboo groves. Some of the trees were laden with moss. One thing's for sure, I didn't recognize any of the vegetation. And the tea trees themselves were so old, but so much smaller than I thought they would be. One of the special things that you can sometimes do with these really old tea trees is you can make a batch of tea from just one tree. Yan, you can see him up here in this tree. He plucked the leaves for, this tree's about 800 years old, and he plucked the tea for our Zhenglong Danshu Gushu Shempuar from this tree. Think about having a job where you've got to climb trees. I mean, I would love that. But in serious terms, we would probably be harnessed in or even in the bucket of a cherry picker or something. And these folks just dart up there and get the job done. And then, of course, there's that long walk back to the village with the tea leaf on your back. Whew. Here are some views of typical processing rooms from elsewhere in China. All the gear is usually kept in a rather large room, like a 2 or 3 car garage, or maybe like a small warehouse. But in Zhenglong, everything was distributed throughout the village. And there wasn't like a special section of the village either that was just for tea processing. It was kind of just all over the place. Panning walks, for example, were tucked underneath or on the sides of homes, fueled by wood fires. So just imagine after a long day of plucking tea, you get home, you grab a quick bite to eat, and then you've got to start up a fire in the panning walk, get the temperature just right so you don't wreck the tea, and it's all just by picking the right wood and stoking the fire just so. That's how you're going to adjust the temperature. And then get to panning some tea in the evening and into the night, after you've had a long walk up into the mountain and back down with that tea on your back. Okay, so the tea gardens and the tea processing isn't the same as here, but we don't really have tea processing. So let's focus in on the village and the life of the villagers to highlight some differences, something we can more relate to. Let's start with the village, for example. This wasn't a 2 or 3 family village. This village was sort of the size of a small town in Canada, and it was made up of a variety of rustic wooden buildings and more modern concrete homes. In fact, I saw a few areas where there were homes or buildings under construction. And it made me wonder, where did they get all the stuff? How did it get here? I mean, of course it was trucked in, but it made me wonder, what if somebody just wanted to fix their roof or do some renovations in the house or just do some minor repairs? I hadn't seen a single, there's no Rona or Home Depot or any hardware store like that. In fact, I hadn't seen any stores except since we left the village where we caught the bus, hours and hours away from the village. At one point, Jan wanted to introduce us to his friend who also made tea. He had just built this place himself. So what am I getting at here? These are talented people. They build their own homes. They make bamboo baskets out of strapping that they make with their own hands. They make tea. They raise animals like pigs, cows, and chickens. I'd seen them running all over the village. And they go on expeditions into the jungle to harvest wild cliff honey. No kidding. Jan's friend had recently gone on an expedition out into the jungle with his son to find a rare kind of hornet's nest that makes this delicious honey. So get this, it's not just to find the rare hornet's nest, but these hornets only nest high on remote cliffs. So a dangerous climb up a cliff is implied. And of course, once you're hanging off the cliff, you've got to deal with these hornets. One way or the other, they did it, and I got to have a taste of this delicious honey. But I'll tell you what, it sure made me wish I was a little more handy around the house. This is Jan and his little brother getting ready to cook supper on an open fire that they built on the floor in the kitchen. So when I see them building this fire, my raised on Smokey the Bear mind starts wondering, geez, do these guys have a carbon monoxide detector installed inside their home? Obviously they didn't, but of course it was perfectly safe. They do this all the time. And I have to say, supper was delicious, and their ability to control the fire and the flame while they cooked supper was really impressive. Now that I think about it, I don't even know where they got the food. I hadn't seen a grocery store anywhere in town. So I've taken you on a fairly wild tour of how different things are in this quaint little village. And not every village in Yunnan province is like this village, but I wanted to use this village to illustrate not just how different things are in Zhenglong village, not just how different things are in Yunnan province, but how different things are everywhere we go in China. This tiny remote village is an exotic and extreme example of just how different things are. But it's different everywhere in China. The restaurants are different, the food, the way to order. The hotels are strangely different. The beds are harder and everything's kind of in a different spot. The street food is different, and you may have questions about hygiene when you see shirtless cooks and whatnot. The street food is also very delicious. The traffic is incredible. Obviously, the signs are all different. When we're on tea trips, Zhen and Zhenli book time in the cities between our remote destinations so that they can decompress. But that doesn't work for me, because everything in China is so different. When we're on tea trips, Zhen and Zhenli booked time in the cities to decompress between these remote outings into the villages and these rural areas, because it's very different even for them. But these city escapes or these decompression times, they don't work for me because everywhere in China is so different. And being on a tea trip, you're in a mindset to learn. So you're wide open And when you don't recognize anything and nothing is familiar, your built-in filters that you have don't work. For example, when you visit a big city in North America, you're also bombarded with information. But there's a certain familiarity, and all the built-in filters, they're so built in fact, you probably forgot you had them. They're working to kind of protect you from this bombardment. When you're in China, you're like a newborn baby and you're hit with everything, and it's really overwhelming. So it's different. It's massively different, and I hope I didn't scare anyone away. The whole reason we go is precisely because it's different. But to get the most out of your trip, you want to be ready, to be prepared. Be prepared mentally, have a clear goal like we said earlier, but also be ready to be overwhelmed and shocked. One of the best ways to handle overwhelm and stress is to be physically ready too. You don't need to be an Olympian or anything like that, but you want to be in good enough shape to handle the time zone change, the climate differences, the hikes up and down the mountains, and whatever else your trip throws at you. If you've been drinking Chinese tea for a while and you've learned a little bit about tea, enough at least to know that it all comes from the same plant, you may be somewhat amazed sometimes by how different each tea can taste when they all come from the same plant. I know even 10 years of drinking Chinese tea and I'm still amazed by how different a dark tea can taste from a really bright and sweet green tea, or how a roasty oolong can be so profoundly different than even just a greener oolong. Possibly even the same cultivar. Take Guanyin for example. So you've got all these different flavors, and maybe you have a favorite Guanyin, or maybe black tea's your favorite, or maybe you have a favorite in each category. But one of the questions we get asked a lot is, how do I know if it's a good tea? When we're tasting tea on a tea trip, we're often tasting 3 to 5 teas at the same time. That means 3 to 5 gaiwans are actually running and brewing at once. In this picture here, you can see we've gone through about 10 to 15 teas in this session, and this may not have been our first session that night. This may have been the second time we cleared the board, if I remember correctly. This is one of the great things about a tea trip. I mean, we taste a lot of tea. One of the things that kind of intimidated me with these tastings is these are all the same tea. I mean, they're all slightly different, but they're all from the same garden. They're all from the same producer. And when I got started with this, I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, or I wouldn't know what to say. Drinking this amount of tea on a tea trip is perfectly normal. It happens all the time. And the side-by-side tastings that I've been doing at home with Jen since I got started have really helped with this. That's why on this channel, we still strongly recommend side-by-side tastings to help accelerate your tasting ability. I was able to notice the differences at home thanks to these side-by-side tastings, and I was able to notice these differences when I was in the field tasting the teas. But what do these differences really mean? In short, these differences mean everything. What type of tea is it? Is it black, dark, oolong, white? What is the cultivar? Is it Guanyin? Is it by Haoyin Zhen? Is the tea made well? Is the tea brewed properly? Where is the tea from? What province or what region? Is the tea well made? Was the kilgreen done right? Was the roasting correct? Was it plucked in the rain? Is the tea really what it says it is? Is that 30-year-old pu'er really 30 years old? Literally everything you need to know about the tea is in that cup and on your taste buds. When I first started learning about the linkage of tasting the tea to the complete story of the tea, I have to admit I was skeptical. I really thought all of this tasting ability was either innate talent or perhaps even magic. In the early days of ZhenTea, I had lots of guided tastings with Jen that helped me start to understand the concept of everything you need to know about the tea is in your cup. But I still wasn't able to picture myself being able to really decode that level of information. I really believed this was just for super tasters like her and Jen Li, and I was pretty sure my job would forever be just writing the tasting notes for the website. Exactly how was I supposed to get all of this information from the tea? It was very blurry to me. Being in the field with Jen Li is nothing but exciting. She is very hands-on with the tea. When we're in the tea garden, she would have me go and grab a bud from a region and taste the raw bud. and she'd ask me, how did it taste? Was it astringent? Is it juicy and refreshing? Watery? Tough and fibrous, or tender? And then she would point out the reasons for the differences. Sunny versus shady, how far the tea was from sources of water. In the processing room, she would have me fetch tea at various stages of processing, right in the middle, and then brew it and taste it, and then quiz me about how it tasted, maybe just after the kilgreen, maybe just after the rolling. At each of these phases, there were noticeable differences in the taste of the tea. This is a great skill of ZhenTea's, being able to not only explain what's happening, but to combine it with an experience and really drive the message home of what it is that's happening. It really helps the lesson stick. In Annecy, she arranged for us to make an oolong from garden to cup, all the way. Not only were we going to get to taste the tea at each stage of the processing, but we were going to move it along each step of the way with our own hands. Super exciting. I even got to try out traditional handshaking. I mean, this is super hard. You can see here that I'm really struggling awkwardly with this basket. And that chain that's holding it is not even just for beginners. That's actually to take the huge strain off your back, because these guys do this for hours a day. Much better than what I'm doing here. But for me, the most memorable phase of making an oolong really had to be the rolling phase. This step is so utterly visceral. You are in constant contact with the tea. This is the step that makes tae guan yin into those little balls or pearls. So what has to happen here is the tea is wrapped up into a blanket quite tightly. And it has to be bundled just so that as you roll it, you can kind of increase the pressure. As you roll the tea kind of against the bench and against your legs, you're just using your whole body to work with the tea. And as you're rolling the tea, as I'm rolling it, the juice starts to come out of the leaf and into this cloth that it's wrapped in, and the juice soaks into the bench, it soaks into your pant legs. The smell in the room becomes beautiful, this fresh, beautiful tea aroma. Then every so often you need to open up the ball of tea and loosen up the ball and rotate it so that the inner leaves get as much rolling as the outer leaves, kind of flip everything all around. Wrap it back up just so and keep going, rolling. Each successive loosening, you get a chance to see the tea. And I could see the tea is transforming. The leaf is getting darker, more wrinkly. It's becoming sticky when you feel it with your hands. To loosen it, you can feel the tea is getting tacky. The smell even starts to transform from that initial fresh booming green to something more almost like, a little bit like a brewery aroma. And this process went on until it was done, which was not a moment too soon because it was so tiring. We finally finished making the tea, and if I'm totally honest, the tea I made was pretty darn mediocre. But having a foundation and side-by-side tasting, and being so lucky to be in these tasting rooms in China and make tea from start to finish really helped me understand that everything you need to know about the tea is really in your cup. In my mind, tea processing became kind of like an exploded apart parts diagram, with each part labeled, showing what it is and how it fits together. Kilgreen, shaking, rolling, roasting. What do each of these contribute to the tea? What are the steps and how do they fit? It all started to make sense. I realized that people who can taste a tea and determine that it was plucked in the rain aren't magic at all. They just have a tremendous amount of experience tasting tea, really tasting it, not just drinking it. This experience didn't suddenly give me magic ZhenTea-like powers, but it did reveal to me that you can taste everything you need to know about the tea, and these skills can be learned. I didn't magically gain ZhenTea-like powers, but I could now clearly see how not only is this possible, but it's learnable. Tasting tea, really tasting tea, is your ultimate guide. It is your source of truth. You will be overwhelmed with information when you're in the tasting rooms in China, even when you're in tea shops wherever you are. You'll have labels making bold claims, vendors telling you all kinds of stories about the tea. Tasting is your foundation. No matter where the information is coming from, remember, everything you need to know about the tea is in your cup. If you're planning a tea trip to China, I've shared with you 3 things that I think are the most important for you to get the most out of your trip. Sharpen your tasting skills. It is your ultimate tool when you're on a tea trip or any time you're tasting tea. It will help you cut through the chaos and even just enjoy your cup of tea more thoroughly. Prepare to be overwhelmed. Prepare mentally and prepare physically. Being prepared will help you handle the overwhelm and the inundation of new things you're going to experience. And have a very specific intent or goal. Don't bite off too much and stay focused so that you can get the most out of your tea trip. You must think I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I sure do. I not only stumbled into a tea family, but I stumbled into probably the most broadly and deeply connected tea family in China. I am the least traveled of the three of us at ZhenTea by far. Jianli has traveled to tea regions all over China. We often hear from her and are surprised to find out she is once again on the road, even when it's not tea season. She's traveling to tea farms to perhaps help farmers make better tea, or maybe just to learn about another quirky aspect of a tea culture she hasn't yet encountered. After 30 years, she's still immensely curious about tea. How to make it better, how to help people make it better, and how to learn even more about it. When there's enough footage, we'll share these excursions here on our YouTube channel. But this barely even scratches the surface of how many places she goes every season and how much information she shares and gathers on each trip. I sincerely hope this information will help you get the most out of your tea trip. I certainly think it will. If you've already been on a tea trip or it did help you and you're watching this in the future, be sure to leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you like the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you like this kind of content, this deep dive into Chinese tea, consider subscribing to our channel for all kinds of great videos about Chinese tea. Until next time, keep steeping.